Hello and welcome to part 2 of Getting Good at Overwatch. This time we'll talk about ensuring the basics. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for watching my last video. It really motivated me to keep going. This time we will talk about what you need to succeed, so a lot of hardware talk, sensitivity and technical stuff that may give you that edge you need and ensures smooth improvement. Now, most of the stuff I talk won't be necessary for most of it, but it's really good to know. Also, I'd like to excuse the microphone pop that you may hear. I sadly lost the little pop filter for my microphone, and I don't really know how to fix that. So what are we talking about today? We'll talk about monitors, mice, mouse pads, keyboards, how many FPS you need, optimal in-game settings, and how to find your right sensitivity. So let's start with monitors. Now, 60 Hz is more than enough. 144 Hz or 120 Hz is optimal though. If you can afford it, upgrading to a 144 Hz monitor is the first thing you should do if you can get the frames needed. So a higher refresh rate gives your brain more information to process per second and it feels super nice. Once you go 144 Hz, you can't go back, so keep that in mind. Now, this sounds like a scientific mumbo jumbo, and you shouldn't think too much about it, but keep that in mind. Now, high refresh rate monitors can be very expensive, but they are well worth the investment. I personally use a BenQ XL2411. It's in full HD, has a low response time, and runs at 144 Hz. So what are some good monitors? If I were you, I'd stick with proven brands. So we have the BenQ XL series, which I personally use, the Asus VG series, which is very good since it uses high refresh rates and runs at full HD. The Asus PG series is a little bit more elite in that it runs at higher resolutions. However, keep in mind that you don't really need a high resolution. Full HD is completely good, and usually PCs can run Overwatch in Full HD at rather high frame rate. Then there's the Asus MG series. Instead of TN panels, they use IPS panels, which basically means that they have better image quality, so the colors look nicer, the contrast is better, stuff like that. So if you like watch a lot of movies and stuff like that and you care about image quality, go for one of the MG series. However, the VG and PG series are better for gaming. There's also ISO, which makes some good monitors from what I've heard. However, I couldn't try one of them yet. Another topic is GSync, FreeSync, and FastSync. Well, in my opinion, you don't really need them. They are only really useful for games where you don't quite reach high frame rates. High frame rate in Overwatch, however, is important, so you won't ever really use that feature. But what about tearing? Well, tearing is if your computer produces more frames than the display can pull up, you'll see half of an image and then half of the next image, which makes the image look as if it's teared apart. Now, this is not as bad as some people make it out to be. It's really not an issue. Next up, we'll talk about mice. Now, optical mice are better according to most, but in my opinion, the difference between a good optical sensor and a good laser sensor is minimal. As long as it's not a trackball or one of those mice where there's a little ball on the bottom that rolls around, you can consider that mouse for competitive gaming. In my opinion, the ergonomics of a mouse are more important than the sensor. If you don't feel comfortable with your mouse, a good sensor won't matter. I personally use a SteelSeries Sensei and I can play comfortably with it. So what mouse should you buy? When in doubt, go to rocketjumpninja.com. Now, Rocket Jump Ninja is a great YouTuber that has played Quake competitively for decades, basically. Now, I don't personally know him, but whenever I am in need of a new mouse, I head to his website first because he does in-depth analysis of every mouse he does and he tests them personally, so you have a really, really good opinion. In my opinion, you should stick with proven brands again. So SteelSeries mice are good, Logitech, Razer, and Zowie. Zowie is used by most FPS professionals. Wired mouse are better, but if a cable will hinder the mouse from moving freely, wireless will do as long as it's good. So, however, if you have problems with the cable kind of creating friction, there are so-called mouse bungees that you can use. They should help with that. Now, the next question is, should you use a cloth pad, a hybrid, or a hard pad? Cloth pads tend to be best for optical mice, and laser mice work best on hard pads, which is the reason why I personally use a hard pad. Cloth pads tend to have more friction, although there are low friction models available. So it basically feels as if you have more control and you can make more precise movements with it. Hard pads, however, let the mouse glide better on the pad, which feels super nice, and I personally prefer it. In the end, however, it's complete personal preference. You should try both and take what's best. Usually, if you buy one, you should be able to return it in case you don't like it. As I said, I personally use a Logitech G4040, which is a hard pad for my laser mouse. The brand doesn't really matter, but in case you want to go with a brand that's proven, Razer, Logitech, or SteelSeries, especially the QCK ones are really, really good. Next up, we have keyboards. Now, keyboards don't really matter at all for FPS. Mechanical keyboards feel nice for some people. However, if you don't need them, you could just save the money because they tend to be rather expensive and use it on something else like a good mouse or a new graphics card to increase your FPS. Good brands for keyboards, however you may want to define good in this case, are Razer keyboards, Logitech ones, and Corsair. Now, obviously, there are other ones, like for instance the DAS keyboard. However, these are the most uh, prevalent ones. Again, you should look for third-party sources if you want some more in-depth analysis of the keyboard market. I personally use a Corsair Strafe RGB. It's really, really fucking fancy, and it has like rainbow lights and shit like that. But again, I could play with a $10 Microsoft keyboard, and it wouldn't affect my performance at all. Maybe I need a couple minutes to get used to it, but after that I should be good to go. Now, this is a really important question. How many FPS do you need? And the simple answer to that is the more, the better. Overwatch uses a one frame buffer, which means that if your computer renders a frame, it'll be put into a buffer first in case the game stutters or the next frame won't come early enough, which would cause lag. In that case, it would take the frame in the buffer. Basically, what this means is that the game will look smoother. However, input lag is increased by 1 divided by your FPS, which means that higher FPS equals lower input lag, which then in turn means more responsive aim. So now we'll go over optimal in-game settings. So here I have my settings menu. For display mode, the ideal one would be full screen. However, it's not really noticeable between full screen and borderless windowed. I personally use borderless windowed because I like the fact that alt tabbing becomes a lot easier. Under resolution, make sure that you selected the resolution with your monitor's highest refresh rate, in my case 144. Your field of view should be max. In my opinion, you should turn off VSync and triple buffering because it just increases the amount of buffers the game uses and thus increases your input lag. Using display performance stat, you get these little stats in the top left corner. I don't actually know if you can see it. You don't really need this on, but it's nice to see how many frames per second you are getting. Under limit FPS, I personally set it to display based. Now this may sound a little hypocrite. Usually you want to set it to custom and then max it out to 300 because obviously the more FPS you have, the lower your input lag. However, with my graphics card, which is a 1070, which is actually kind of high end, I'm not capable of getting 300 FPS consistently, especially not in team fights. So instead I put it display based, which basically limits the frame rate to your monitor's refresh rate plus 10. So for me this is around 155, I think. And I can always reach 155, which means that my input lag is higher, however it stays consistent. So if I train my muscle memory to tolerate a certain input lag, it won't be affected by frame rate drops. The advanced graphics settings are the most important part. For render scale, you can just use 100%. Some pros use lower render scale, which makes the game look pixelated, but in return gives higher FPS. But if your computer can handle it, just stay with 100. Texture quality and texture filtering quality can be maxed on like every single machine basically. It really doesn't impact performance unless you have VRAM issues, and there isn't really a graphics adapter that can't handle high textures in Overwatch. You want to set local fog detail to low because fog only hinders your vision. I personally turned dynamic reflections off because it completely fucks up your frame rate. Like it on some systems it can just halve your frame rate, so just turn it off. You don't even see the difference. You shouldn't turn off shadows completely. You should rather put it on low or medium. I actually should probably put it on medium because shadows can give you valuable information. For instance, when you peek around a corner, which doesn't happen that often in other competitive FPS games like CSGO, it's more important. Shadow details, unless it really, really bogs down your frame rate, you should at least have shadows. Model detail, you can this is a little bit debatable. If you put it on low, certain foliage in the game won't be rendered, which means that it won't block your vision. So obviously low is the best in this case. However, some other models in the game tend to look really crappy, so you need to sacrifice graphics quality for performance in this case. I set the effects detail to low. I can still see abilities. However, in a team fight, it's not as messed up. which can help with visibility. I set lighting quality to low because you don't really need the lights, and it still looks decently without them, and it just bugs down your frame rate. Anti-aliasing, I have it set to ultra because it doesn't really affect frame rate that much because it doesn't support MSAA. However, off would probably be the best because SMAA tends to blur the picture a little bit. In this case, I went for picture quality instead of performance. Refraction quality is the little shimmer around certain explosive or particle effects. You don't really need them, to be honest. However, it doesn't really affect frame rate as much, so you can probably stick it in high and wouldn't really do much. Local reflections basically make your weapons and things around you look nicer. So for instance, McCree's gun reflects the light a little better, but this obviously costs you frames, so I turned it off. Same thing with ambient occlusion. It makes edges and shadows going into edges look a little better and more realistic, but obviously it can destroy your frame rate, so you shouldn't really have it on. For sound, there are only a couple of things that are important. For one, you want to set group voice chat to off and team voice chat to auto join, so that when you go into a competitive game, you're automatically in voice chat. Make sure that you use push to talk unless you have an external push to talk adapter. The reason for this is that if your mic is noisy and you set it to open mic, people will hate you for it. In my opinion, you should turn on Dolby Atmos for headphones. Now, this again is heavily debated whether it actually gives you a benefit or not, but I personally think it helps, so I'll turn it on. So the next question is crosshair. I personally swap out my crosshairs on a hero to hero basic, mainly because of visuals. Your crosshair doesn't really matter. There are two exceptions for this. Zarya's crosshair, her default crosshair, shows a charge around her crosshair, so that can be a nice indicator. And Hanzo's crosshair has a little guidelines on how much the arrow will drop. You obviously don't need them, but it doesn't really matter. Other than that, just use what's preferable for you. So for on some heroes, I like the circle. On others, like McCree, I like the short crosshairs, or maybe the dot. But it doesn't really matter again. The color, on the other hand, you should use something that has high contrast. The best colors for that are pink, green, and cyan. White and black are not very visible most of the time. Red can be annoying to look at if you play for prolonged periods of time. Yellow can go under in certain maps. For instance, on Temple of Anubis, yellow isn't really that great. Bloom can be, this basically means that your crosshair expands if weapon inaccuracy increases. You don't really need it, in my opinion, so I turned it off. Now, under gameplay, you want to make sure that always skip kill cam is turned to off. The reason for this is that you can learn a lot from kill cams. For instance, you can see the enemy ultimate charge, and you can see how you died. So it's like a little bot analysis mid-game. Make sure to turn on the kill feed. Seeing the kill feed gives you instant information on whether you have the upper hand or not, and you can base decisions off of that. It's basically mandatory. So these are the, in my opinion, optimal settings. Next up, we'll find your right sensitivity. Pros use 400, 800, or 1600 DPI most of the time. And the term eDPI, or effective DPI, basically means your DPI multiplied by the in-game sense. 4000 eDPI is average amongst pros. That's 400 DPI 10 cents, 800 DPI 5 cents, or 1600 DPI 2.5 cents. Laser mice, however, on different pads can mess this up. For instance, my laser mouse, the SteelSeries Sensei, on a mouse pad doubles the sensitivity. I personally use 800 DPI 2 cents, which in reality is more like 800 DPI 4 cents. Because of this, there's a universal sense term, which is cm per 360, or in countries that don't use the metric system but the imperial one, inches per 360. And it basically means how many centimeters you need to move your mouse for a 360 in-game. Around 34.6 centimeters per 360 is average. You can find this out by simply using a ruler and measuring it. So as I said, my personal sense is 800 DPI and 2 cents. So how can you find your perfect sensitivity? It's really hard, but you kind of have to jump into cold water. Just set your sensitivity to the average pro sense and play for it for a while. Now, if you tend to lift your mouse a lot because your mouse pad is too small or you don't have enough space, then you should increase it. However, you feel like you play inconsistently, you should probably lower it. The reason for this is the higher your sensitivity, the more sensitive, as the word suggests, your mouse is to move on. If you have a cold day, like literally your room is cold and you are shivering a little bit, those little shivers can actually mess up your aim, whereas with a lower sensitivity it doesn't matter as much. You want to make sure that you have a big mouse pad. I probably should have mentioned that earlier. Big mouse pads are essential for low sensitivity gaming because you don't have to lift your mouse as much. The next big question is arm or wrist aiming. The best is a mix of both. Aiming with your wrist alone is, for one, very inconsistent because it requires you to have a high sense, or else you can't really turn. It damages your wrist in the long run. Using your arm for big turns and your wrist for fine adjustments, or microflicks as we call them, is best. It will take some getting used to, but there is a reason why people who make a living playing video games use their arm most of the time. In the end, it's personal preference. There are pro players that wrist aim exclusively. However, aiming with your wrist will not stop you from climbing usually. Next up, how should you grip your mouse? Now, this literally doesn't matter. It really doesn't. Grabbing your mouse is something intuitive. Just hold it in a way it feels comfortable. Terms like claw grip, palm grip, or fingertip grip are thrown around a lot, and they're really cool words, but they don't really affect performance. Again, I'd like to thank you for watching. Next time, we'll talk about establishing a training schedule and how setting correct expectations help you improve.